Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialist.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Mark O'Kane, who's a consultant with us at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider Talk Cyber. So today, Mark and I are going to be talking about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or the NIST CSF, and specifically we're going to be looking at the govern function within the CSF. So first question for you, Mark, is what is the NIST CSF and where does the govern function fit within it?
So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or as it's frequently called, NIST CSF, is a framework that helps organizations to effectively govern and manage their cybersecurity risk. So the framework itself was created in 2014 in the US. And whilst it was initially intended for companies working in critical national infrastructure, it's gone on since then to be adopted by companies of all different industries across the world. And that includes companies, whether they be small, medium, or large. The framework itself has three components at a high level. So this includes the tiers, which help to categorize the maturity of the organization's security controls. So, for example, if a company is doing web filtering, the tiers would help to explain how mature that is and how effectively it's working. There's also the organizational profiles, which provide high-level summaries of the organization's current security posture and what it wants its security posture to be like in the future. And then it also includes what's called the CSF core, which are effectively a number of controls or outcomes that organizations would strive to achieve. So quite similar, I would say, to the Annex A controls that you would find in ISO 27001. The core contains 6 functions, so the outcomes are split into 6 categories. You've got the govern function, identity, detect, protect, respond, and recover. So where the govern function fits into this is it basically requires organizations to look at cybersecurity from their own context. So what is your organization's mission? What are your values? What products and services do you offer? What are the needs and expectations of your stakeholders? And use that to establish your cybersecurity risk management strategy for your business. You also then have to use the results of your risk management activities to improve your risk strategy as you go along, because as we know, the security risk landscape is changing all the time, and what your company may need today may be different in a year's time. The govern function also requires companies to establish an overarching cybersecurity policy, essentially highlighting the governing principles that the organization will follow in facing its cybersecurity risks. It also requires companies to establish key roles and responsibilities for cybersecurity within the business and communicate those to relevant personnel as well. And then lastly, at a high level, it requires organizations to establish processes that will help it to govern cybersecurity risk in relation to its supply chain. So not just risks that originate internally, but risks that come from your third-party suppliers as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. You spoke about how the govern function requires organizations to establish their cybersecurity risk management strategy. How should organizations approach this task, especially if they're doing it for the first time? So
one of the benefits of the govern function, Annie, is that it provides a clear set of criteria within the core that companies can use. So when companies are working on their cybersecurity strategy for the first time, it can be a very daunting task. It goes without saying. So NIST essentially helps organizations by providing a clear, well-tested criteria that they can use. So this basically includes things like establishing your risk objectives. So once you've identified what your key risks are as a business from a security point of view, NIST basically says you should establish clear objectives. So what are the things you want to achieve off the back of that? So a good example would be if your business is concerned that you may not be able to recover quickly from a ransomware attack, an objective for that might be by the end of the year, you're going to aim to be conducting more backups so that if a ransomware attack does occur, you can obtain a more appropriate backup quicker. You also need to get consensus on your company's risk appetite and your risk tolerance. So risk appetite is basically the level of risk strategically your company is willing to accept. So it could be things like we have a high tolerance on risk relating to product development because we're highly invested in innovation and getting into new markets, or we have low tolerance for risk that may affect the company's reputation. Risk tolerance is related to that insofar as it focuses on how far the organization is willing to go along with that appetite before it has to go to management and say, hey, we need to do something about this separately. Other than that, the framework requires companies to incorporate its cyber risk approach with its overall enterprise risk strategy. And the reason for this is that very often, unfortunately, cybersecurity risk is treated not treated the same as other areas of risk, so such as financial risk or legal risk. Cyber risk is often treated separately to that. NIST turns around and says that this should be treated the same and follow the same processes as other areas of business risk. You then have to define your risk treatment options. So this quite often is as simple as saying, are we going to treat the risk? Are we going to terminate the risk? Are we going to transfer responsibility to a third party? Or are we going to tolerate the risk? So make your risk treatment, define your risk treatment options, and then communicate those to those involved in your risk strategy. You have to have communication lines in place for people involved with your risks. So risk owners have to be able to notify management if a risk needs escalating. Suppliers that you're working with have to have reporting mechanisms so that if they need to tell the business that an incident occurs or is occurring, they can notify the business via a clear channel. Additionally, what NIST says is you should also prioritize your risks based on criticality. And then lastly, it requires you to look at not just the negative cybersecurity risks you might be facing, but also the positive risks. So what are the opportunities we can have if we take the positive opportunities we can take if we take this risk in order to benefit the business?
So I know that the functions are in an order and govern is first. Why is this the case? Why does NIST put govern first? And what changes when an organisation actually treats governance as the foundation rather than an afterthought?
So one way I would phrase it is that the govern function certainly does come first insofar as the first thing companies should be doing when establishing their cyber risk strategy is looking at their own context and looking at their own cybersecurity risks and how they're going to address them. But in addition to that, the govern risk also I would say doesn't particularly sit alongside the other functions, but rather permeates itself throughout the other functions as well. So for example, if you look at the other technical functions such as protect, detect, respond, if you look at the outcomes within those, like incidents are reported and triaged, or personnel are receiving appropriate cyber training in relation to their role, the govern function sort of gives a governing aspect to those functions. So it asks and essentially helps to bridge the gap between the technical on the ground controls that you're applying and the organization's risk strategy. So again, if we use the example of incidents are reported and triaged, the govern function requires you to ask, okay, so who is responsible for reporting incidents? How are incidents reported? is the way incidents are reported and triaged currently working for the business? Is it aligned with our strategy? So at a high level, it requires what the govern function does is it helps businesses to hit the ground running for cyber risk, but then helps them to govern those outcomes as they move on. So yeah, as I said before, within a year or two's time, the controls that you have in place may be working, or they may require adjustment based on new risk or new business priorities. And the govern function helps you to do that.
CSF talks about cybersecurity policy being established, communicated, and monitored. What does a good policy actually look like, and who should be responsible for shaping it?
So essentially, a good cybersecurity policy, according to NIST, is based on the needs of the organization. So things you may wish to consider would be, does it address the risks to our products and services? Does it talk about our mission and the risks that could affect our ability to achieve that mission or achieve those goals? It should essentially talk about what your organization's cybersecurity strategy looks like. That policy also needs to be communicated, as we've said, to relevant personnel so that they're aware of what your cybersecurity principles are and how they should apply those within their roles. We've also said that the policy needs to be enforced. So essentially this means that it should be made clear to relevant personnel that this policy is a part of their job description, that they need to follow this policy and apply it in their respective roles. A good cybersecurity policy also has to be reviewed over time in order to remain relevant. Because again, within a year or two's time, your business's priorities might change. You may have new products and services on the market. You might be getting into new markets. You might have expanded as a business, or you may have adopted new technologies. So a good cybersecurity policy has to be adapted in order to continue to be relevant to your business context. And another thing that NIST requires is that this policy should also be not just communicated at the offset, such as when somebody joins the business, or communicated when the policy is first established, but it should also be re-communicated whenever important changes occur, such as, again, if your company's mission changes, or if new threats arise, or if you adopt new technologies or key business changes. The policy needs to be adapted and re-communicated based upon that. In terms of who establishes it, so the framework doesn't state specifically who is responsible for establishing your cybersecurity policy. What it does say is that it has to be established by relevant stakeholders. So typically this would be your senior management team. It could be the board as a whole, or it could be the CEO, or it could be your chief information security officer. One good practice that would be recommended, since the framework says that the policy has to be approved by stakeholders, as we said, yes, typically it would be approved by senior management, but also consider who your other stakeholders are. So do you have investors who need to have their input? Do you have regulators that would expect you to incorporate certain requirements? So essentially, who should establish the policy? The framework says it should be your stakeholders, typically senior management, but an important practice would be to consider other stakeholders you might have who need to have a say in the policy as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. You mentioned that NIST CSF requires a risk management strategy to also address risks relating to third-party suppliers. How should organisations following the CSF aim to address such risks?
So essentially what NIST CSF recommends here is that organizations have to create processes suitable to them that allow them to effectively manage risk pertaining to their supply chain. So NIST is making a really important point here by emphasizing that your organization's risk doesn't just stop at your own walls. By working with third-party suppliers, particularly if they're going to be using your data or storing your data, you inherit their risks. So a good example would be if you're managing a hospital and you're storing patient data on a third-party application, there is a possibility that application could have unexpected downtime. Now, whilst that's a risk that the company making the application is responsible for, it's still a risk to you because your patient data is on the line. So essentially, their risks become your risks. So to manage this, NIST requires organizations to define their approach to managing these risks. So this is typically done through establishing a supplier policy that states the principles you're going to follow when working with suppliers. It also describes the principles that you're aiming to apply to your suppliers, because if you're going to be working with them and you're going to be adopting their risk, you want to make sure that they're managing that risk in a way that works for you and works with your risk strategy. You also have to establish relevant objectives and processes that are agreed with your stakeholders as well. You also have to establish relevant roles and responsibilities when dealing with supplier risk. So, for example, who's responsible for conducting due diligence assessments before you agree to work with a supplier? Who is responsible for accepting any risks? Who conducts those risk assessments? Who manages your supplier relationships on an ongoing basis? But also, what are the roles and responsibilities of your suppliers? So who is responsible for reporting a cyber incident to your business if something happens on their side? Once you've done all of this, NIST says that you should identify the risks for your suppliers and then categorize your suppliers based on how critical they are. I would say ultimately, it's what NIST requires is that your supply chain risk shouldn't be managed separately to your cyber risk in general. It should be integrated into your overall cybersecurity strategy and how your business aims to manage risk at the enterprise level. And ultimately, the key thing is that whatever your risk management strategy looks like at a company level, those principles should be applied to your suppliers as well, so that your entire ecosystem can operate within your risk appetite as a business.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. For any of our listeners that would like to read up on the govern function, we've got a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called The Core Functions of NIST CSF Govern. So do go and check that out. And thank you very much for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.